This Sunday, health and the economy. President Trump pivots from fighting the virus.
This country can't stay closed and locked down for years.
To promoting the economy, even trying to shut down the coronavirus task force before backing off.
I had no idea how popular the task force is until actually yesterday.
Mr. Trump questioning science.
I feel about vaccines like I feel about tests. This is going to go away without a vaccine.
And insisting it's time to get back to normal as the economy suffers.
We can't stop working. We can't stop living.
But at what cost?
If it really picks up, it's very hard to stop again.
Why conquering the virus versus getting people back to work is a false choice. Plus, 3 top health officials now in some form of quarantine after possible exposure inside the White House. My guests this morning, infectious disease specialist Michael Osterholm and Jeffrey Shaman, and Republican Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee. Also,
historic unemployment disaster.
As unemployment hits numbers not seen since the Great Depression.
I'm going to be homeless if I don't open my business back up.
I'm not trying to be a scuffler, I'm trying to make a living.
My conversation this morning with billionaire businessman and philanthropist Robert F. Smith on making sure no one is left out of recovery efforts.
We have to reinvest so that when we come out of the back end of this pandemic, we're actually in a much better position.
And the latest on the Michael Flynn and Tara Reade stories. Joining me for insight and analysis are NBC News White House correspondent Kristen Welker, Richard Haas, president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and Wall Street Journal columnist Peggy Noonan. Welcome to Sunday. It's Meet the Press and our continuing coverage of the coronavirus pandemic.
From NBC News in Washington, the longest-running show in television history, this is Meet the Press with Chuck Todd.
Good Sunday morning and a happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there. President Trump is making it clear that he's moving away from fighting the coronavirus to cheerleading an economic recovery. On Tuesday, Mr. Trump announced he was winding down the White House task force. Then a day later undid the undoing, while continuing to urge the reopening of the country in defiance even of his own task force reopening guidelines. The president also chose not to wear a mask at a mask-producing factory because the AP reported he believes it would send the message that he's more concerned with health than with the economy. Meanwhile, 3 top health officials have become a partial or full self-quarantine after 2 people working in the White House became infected, indicating just how hard it is to keep the virus out of even the most tested and secure workplaces in this country. All this on a week when the confirmed number of cases in the United States passed 1.3 million and the death toll is approaching 80,000 now. It is not partisan to say the administration's response to this coronavirus pandemic has been both confused and confusing, and it raises troubling questions. What's the plan for testing and contact tracing? Or does the federal government think that's just too hard to do without a breakthrough? What's the plan for maintaining social distancing as states reopen? What's the plan for making people feel confident about returning to work when even the White House can't keep the virus out? And what's the plan for treating this pandemic as our greatest national crisis since the Second World War? In other words, what's the plan?
People want to come back. I think everybody in this room realizes we have to come back.
Facing a pandemic that shows no signs of containment, the president is making it clear he is not willing to wait for a national decline in cases or deaths, instead pushing states to reopen now.
There'll be more death, but the virus will pass. I used to say 65,000, and now I'm saying 80 or 90, and it goes up. We may be talking about 95,000 people ultimately. We may be talking about something more than that.
The White House is sidelining scientists, delaying the CDC's attempts at issuing detailed guidelines, reportedly out of fear they were too stringent.
And I respect the governors, and I've given them great discretion. I've given the leeway to the governors.
Do you find the CDC protocols to be an impediment to opening up the country?
Which protocols?
The recommended guidelines that have been.
No, because I'm relying on the governors.
The administration distanced itself from a draft federal government report predicting an uptick in new coronavirus cases and 3,000 deaths a day by June 1st. And the president announced the White House task force was off.
We're now looking at a little bit of a different form.
Before declaring it on again after public pushback.
So we're keeping the task force for period of time.
And Mr. Trump is dismissing the consensus of public health experts that widespread testing is a necessary step to reopening businesses safely.
In a way, by doing all of this testing, we make ourselves look bad.
Repeating his claim that the virus will disappear on its own.
I feel about vaccines like I feel about tests. This is going to go away without a vaccine.
The president's skepticism of public health guidance is now being echoed by many of the governors who support him.
These models have been so wrong from day one.
Those models keep changing, so really they're not very good.
Because we did so much more testing, we have more cases.
We were going to the hot spot and we were testing, so of course our positive cases are going to increase.
We have to be warriors. We can't keep our country closed down for years.
We can't keep our economy shut down forever.
But 68% of Americans continue to say they are more concerned that state governments will lift restrictions too quickly than that they may take too long. Still, with the unemployment rate now 14.7%, pressure is growing, and the president is accusing Democrats of slowing reopening to damage him politically.
They think they're doing it because it'll hurt me the longer it takes to hurt me in the election, the longer it takes to open up.
And joining me now are two infectious disease experts, Michael Osterholm from the University of Minnesota and Columbia University's Jeffrey Shaman. Gentlemen, welcome to Meet the Press. Dr. Osterholm, let me start with you. Simple question. Are we ready to reopen the economy?
Well, first of all, let me just say that when we say what we mean by opening the economy, that's really unclear. We can't stay locked down for 18 months. But at the same time, when you have cases increasing, deaths increasing, healthcare workers without adequate protective equipment, and we're suddenly going back to what was once our normal lives, that's not a safe place to be. We can't do that and not expect to see a major increase in cases.
Jeffrey Shaman, have we squandered the 8 weeks in lockdown in that, or are we either rushing the reopening in that we don't have the testing and tracing program in place yet, or have we just squandered the 8 weeks?
We have not used the 8 weeks as well as we could have, unfortunately. It would have been benefited enormously from consistent messaging and a concerted, consolidated plan of attack for actually aggressively and proactively dealing with this virus. At this point, however, we do have to pick ourselves up where we are, and we need to start taking those measures. We need to look at some of the countries that have been very successful in quashing this virus down. In particular, I would point to Korea, South Korea, and Germany, and maybe even New Zealand and Taiwan. These are countries, in particular in the cases of Germany and South Korea, that had enormous outbreaks. They flattened them, they crushed them down, and they did this because they tested so aggressively, and they used contact tracing, and they were able to quarantine people who were becoming infectious before they actually spread to other people. It's a very powerful measure. It requires real investment, but we already have models that show that it can work. And once you've done that, then you're in this position of strength where reopening the economy is not going to lead necessarily to the rebound in cases that I'm expecting given this patchwork response we have right now and the reopenings taking place in some states.
Michael Osterholm, it seems as if the federal government is sitting waiting for a testing breakthrough before beginning, waiting to see if there could be a faster testing program before they commit to essentially a national testing program. You're going to hear a guest in a minute say that. We've heard Dr. Birx say this. I think we all want a tech breakthrough. What do you do before then?
Well, we have to understand that we're riding this tiger, we're not directing it. This virus is going to do what it's going to do. What we can do is only nibble at the edges, and I think it's not a good message to send to the public that we can control this virus in a meaningful way. And what I mean by that is, even though, as Jeffrey just said, some countries have been able to suppress this somewhat, Korea has now got a major outbreak problem occurring. Germany has had an increase in cases. What we have to tell people honestly, what they want to hear, they don't want to sugarcoat it and they don't want to coat it in fear, but somewhere between now and tomorrow, next year, we're going to see 60 to 70% of Americans ultimately infected with this virus. What we have to do is figure out how not just to die with the virus, but also how to live with it. And we're not having that discussion. As Lewis Carroll once said, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And right now, that's where we're at. And we can't give people a false sense of security that we're going to do more than we can, but we also have to figure out how to live with this virus, and that's what we're not doing.
Jeffrey Shaman, one of the reasons why you heard it in our opening piece there are a lot of people that don't a lot of these governors are feeling as if the models let them down for some reason. You know, they were looking at them for, maybe they were reading them for a specific that a model wasn't intended to give them. But no matter what, there has been some skepticism about the various models out there. First of all, what do the models show is going to happen by the end of the month due to this reopening? And what are how do you know if a model is reliable?
Those are really important questions. So firstly, the models can't forecast things. They're not prognostic in that way. And so what is the point of running them into the future then? Well, we have to do that because we want to get a sense of what may happen in the future. And the projections that we make with these models have to have baked into them, on top of a lot of other uncertainties, scenarios as to what we're going to do. So if a number of states, now it's in the 30s, are going to reopen, we don't know what the impact of those loosening restrictions really is going to be. Governors can open and say businesses are open, but it doesn't mean that all restaurants and businesses will open. And it also doesn't mean that the public will actually frequent those businesses. As you quoted, 68% of the public is really concerned about this virus and considers that a greater priority than the economy. So many people actually won't go out and use them to the degree they did pre-pandemic. As a result of all these uncertainties, it's very difficult to know what's going to happen, how that's actually going to affect the transmission dynamics of the virus, whether it's going to accelerate and rebound and at what time scales. That said, in a lot of the states in which they are loosening restrictions, they are barely hanging on. And in some of them, they already have growth of the virus taking place. One would imagine that any loosening of restrictions there is only going to accelerate the growth of the virus. For the projections that we see, you're going to see a range of outcomes. And they have, as I said, all this uncertainty in them. And they are going to change as we come to realize that, well, we actually did this and not this in terms of social distancing. And it has these consequences upon the infection. What I think we're probably going to see over the coming weeks towards the end of the month is we're just going to start to see a growth in cases. It's not going to happen over the next week or two. It's going to come in with a lag because there are lags in the system. And that is that the people who get infected today, we don't see them as confirmed cases for another couple weeks. And that built-in delay means that any changes that we do to social distancing because of reopening, we're not going to realize for a couple weeks until we're already into some period of growth.
Michael Osterholm, I want you to respond to something the president said on the whole concept of testing. Let me play it again for the audience and get you to respond on the other side. Here's what he said earlier this week.
This is why the whole concept of tests aren't necessarily great. The tests are perfect, but something can happen between a test where it's good and then something happens and all of a sudden she was tested very recently and tested negative. And then today, I guess, for some reason, she tested positive.
Now, Michael Osterholm, the president seemed to indicate that that was somehow a failure. But if you're doing a testing and contact tracing program, it sounds like what the White House is doing is a success story. No?
Well, it is to the extent that they're finding these cases. I think the point that I want to come back to, though, Chuck, this virus is going to keep transmitting whether or not whatever we do. We can nibble it at the edges. In some cases, like New York and other cities did, you can surely shave off the top of that peak. But let's just remember, this virus is on its own. In 1918, when influenza virus occurred, we had these big peaks in the spring in several selected cities in this country, and then it just went away for 4 months and came back with a vengeance. You know, I worry right now more than anything if this virus suddenly starts to disappear. Because in fact, what that may tell us is we are going to act like an influenza pandemic, and come late summer, early fall, we could have a peak that could make everything else that we've done so far look mild. Contact tracing and testing are important, but they won't stop that. That's what we need to start planning for. What are the different scenarios that are going to get us from 5 to 15% of the U.S. population, as it is currently have been infected, to what it will be 60 or 70%. We don't have a plan for that. That's what we need a plan for.
What is the likelihood, Michael Osterholm, that this testing situation can get ramped up without a tech breakthrough? I mean, is this something that if we just, you know, sort of a trench warfare, is it something we can do as a country?
You know, it's not, and it's one that, again, we're going to be putting a report out next week that will really go into detail. Just look at one thing. We've all been talking about reagents. Do you know that we're running all the test equipment right now 24/7 in ways it's never been meant to be run? Imagine if you had a brand new car that could go 100 miles an hour and you ran it nonstop for 6 weeks, 24 hours a day. At the end of that time, it probably wouldn't work very well. Well, we're seeing the testing equipment right now beginning to break down in ways that we still can't do testing in the future. So testing is an important issue, but the infrastructure is just not there. You know, we can't do it. And so what we have to do, again, is have that plan. What are we going to do for testing? What are we going to do to bring the economy back? What are we going to do to deal with healthcare workers and their protection? What are we going to do with too many people in the hospital such that beds are no longer available? That's what we need a plan for, and we don't have it. I can't say that enough times. We keep nibbling at the edges about whether a few people in the White House are infected or not. We need a plan.
It's how we ended our opening monologue. What's the plan? Michael Osterholm of the University of Minnesota, Jeffrey Shaman of Columbia University, thank you for getting us started with your expertise in this. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And joining me now from Maryville, Tennessee, is Senator Lamar Alexander. He's chair of the Senate Health and Education Committee, where Dr. Fauci will be testifying on Tuesday. Senator Alexander, welcome back to Meet the Press, sir.
Thank you, Chuck. Good morning.
Good morning. You've been a big proponent of this initiative over at NIH, which you've compared to the show Shark Tank, essentially to develop a rapid screening test that can be a game changer that will allow us to do rapid testing and quarantining of folks, be able to really ramp up a testing and contact tracing program. Dr. Birx on this program has said our solution to testing has to be a breakthrough. You are hoping for a technological breakthrough. Dr. Birx is hoping for a technological breakthrough. So are the rest of us. What do we do in between? What do we do right now?
Well, here's what Tennessee is doing and the country's doing. We have, Senator Schumer was nice enough to quote half of what I said at our hearing last week on testing. I said what we're doing is impressive. He left that out, but not nearly enough. Here's what the governor is doing today. He's testing prisoners in every prison, every nursing home, drive-through testing on the weekends. Go to the local public health department, you get a free test. His motto is, if in doubt, get a test. And so as a result, Tennessee has tested more than most states. It's at about 3.6% of the population. He hopes to be at 7% by the end of May.
That is what every state needs. And I guess the question I have is, are you concerned that we have not ramped up testing and contact tracing in this 8-week period as high as we needed to in order to reopen?
Well, what we've done is very impressive. I mean, according to Johns Hopkins, the United States has tested more than 8 million people. That's twice as many as any country, more per capita than almost all countries, including South Korea. It's enough to do what we need to do today to reopen, but it's not enough, for example, when 35,000 kids and faculty show up on the University of Tennessee campus in August. That's why we need what Dr. Birx called, what Francis Collins is working on, a breakthrough. Mm-hmm. For example, you might be able to put a lollipop in your mouth with a swab, take a picture of it with your cell phone. If it lights up, you're positive. Or you send that swab to a laboratory that's not too far away, and they use what they call gene sequencing machines, which are already there. They can do tens of thousands of tests very quickly.
What do you do? Let me ask you this philosophically about businesses. You can open an economy, but you can't force the return of demand. So whether you're an airline or you're a restaurant, we know demand is going to be down. And at the same time, their demand is down through no fault of their own. How do you rescue those businesses, and how do you rescue those employees?
Number one, vaccine. And the administration has an amazingly ambitious goal of 100 million vaccines by September and 300 by December. I have no idea if we can reach that. Number two is treatments. More will be this summer, but between now and then, testing. I mean, if you take a test and you know that you don't have COVID-19 and you know that everybody around you took a test that same day, you're going to have enough confidence to go back to work and back to school.
Are you concerned that the White House doesn't see the testing issue as important as you and others do?
I've talked with almost everybody on the task force. I talked with the White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, who helped negotiate what we call the Shark Tank, where you throw all these early concept ideas in with Francis Collins, who heads the National Institutes of Health. I think we're all pushing for as many tests as fast as we can get them. Track one is to accelerate the technologies we already have. But if you want the lollipop that'll give you an instant test, you're going to need a new technology, and that's what Dr. Collins' Shark Tank is all about.
Final question. Are you disappointed that the president decided to go ahead with the Obamacare lawsuit? There was a window where he could have the Justice Department could have pulled out of it. They didn't. He wanted to continue forward. If you undo Obamacare, what's the plan to replace it?
Well, the answer to your question is yes. I thought the Justice Department argument was really flimsy. I mean, what they're arguing is that when we voted to get rid of the individual mandate, we voted to get rid of Obamacare. I don't know one single senator that thought that.
Right. Senator Lamar Alexander, I'm going to have to leave it there. Thanks but actually, before I let you go, you do have a mask that will, for longtime Alexander watchers, will be kind of fitting. Show it to us.
There it is, and I wear it.
I was just going to say there should be no other mask any member of the Alexander family should be wearing as well. Senator Alexander, thanks for coming on and sharing your views, sir, and we'll look forward to seeing your committee hearing with Dr. Fauci on Tuesday.
Thank you, Chuck.
When we come back, that devastating jobs report and how one man is trying to make sure that help gets to people who need it the most. Welcome back. As devastating as the jobs numbers were on Friday, they were even worse for some. Unemployment among African Americans, 16.7%, 2.5 points higher than among whites, and Latino unemployment was even higher. That comes after small businesses, especially those in communities of color, were largely shut out of the government's Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP as it's known. Well, enter billionaire businessman and philanthropist Robert F. Smith, who is taking steps to make sure that minority-owned businesses get their fair share of funds in Phase 2 of the PPP program. And Robert F. Smith joins me this morning. Mr. Smith, thank you for coming on. Let me just start with this observation and get your big picture take. When you look at what this pandemic has done, is it in some ways it's been an MRI on inequality, whether it's on health outcomes for communities of color, or now we're seeing the economic impact. It's communities of color that are getting hit first. Knowing that going forward, what does our rescue plan need to look like as far as you're concerned?
Sure. And Chuck, thank you for having me on the program this morning. You know, as a good friend of mine has said, this is a pandemic on top of a series of epidemics. And I think the important thing that we have to do is continue to rally as Americans to come with real, lasting, scalable solutions to enable the communities that are getting hit first, hardest, and probably will take the longest to recover with solutions that will enable their communities to thrive again. We were coming into a period of time, quite frankly, in America where we were actually getting some economic activity back in these communities. So I'm thinking and working with a number of folks in Washington, with community leaders, with fintech companies, including one that we own, to enable these banks to really drive some economic opportunity back into these communities.
What do you think, frankly, that Washington failed to understand about how small businesses, particularly in communities of color, what did they fail to understand about their banking relationships where this money just didn't get to them?
Well, what's interesting, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a failure to understand. And in fact is we just had an erosion of what I term as a capillary banking system in America. Many of these small communities, urban, rural, aren't being banked by the larger institutions. And what actually gets to these small businesses are these community development financial institutions, the minority development institutions, depository institutions. We call them CDFIs and MDIs. And these are the capillary banking systems that actually get to these customers, these small businesses, and they didn't have access going into this program, the PPP program, to the SBA in many cases. But I will say that through frankly, leadership in Washington. We've had people like Ivanka Trump and Senator Mnuchin who've been very engaged in this process with me and a number of community leaders to build out and rebuild and fortify some of the infrastructure for these CDFIs and MDIs, so they now, in this second wave, have had access to the PPP funding. And hopefully, if we get this right, which we are all determined to, we will leave permanent infrastructure so these institutions now have the capacity to drive regenerative capital back into those communities.
Go even bigger picture for me. In the rescue plan that Congress put out there the first time, that essentially put $6 trillion in play, $4 trillion in the credit markets with the Fed, $2 trillion in actual cash, and yet now it looks like they underestimated the total calamity here. Do you see the next round being more like the first, or do you think it needs to be reimagined?
I think it needs to be reimagined. We have to take this opportunity to reinvest in our business infrastructure, in these small to medium businesses, in our banking infrastructure, and what I call these capillary banking systems, so that we can actually emerge out of this even stronger. We have to invest. I'm in the world of software, as you know. We have to invest in technology and software so that the banking systems these capillary banking systems are more efficient. They have more access to capital. They have more transparency. They actually then can engage with these businesses that are in the communities that are frankly underbanked and in many cases not banked at all. 94% of African American businesses, for instance, are sole proprietorships. 70% are underbanked, or there are no banks. We have banking deserts in these communities. And so we would be remiss if we didn't take a significant portion of capital to reinvest in the infrastructure, delivering capital back into those businesses, and frankly, reinvest in those businesses and give them technology and capabilities so there's more transparency, visibility, and giving their businesses an opportunity to grow, scale, and operate more efficiently. So it is our opportunity, even though we're in a challenging time, and my heart goes out to many families who've lost people. And the fact of the matter is, our first responders, a lot of them are coming from our communities. We have to reinvest so that when we come out of the back end of this pandemic, we're actually in a much better position. I don't want to see us going back to the same position where we were, where we had these underbanked and these banking deserts in these communities.
We are at basically about the 1 year anniversary when you were the commencement speaker at Morehouse, and you took care of the entire graduating classes, student loans, took care of their debt, basically an attempt to try to deal with some of these generational inequalities. And I can't help but in those same communities, what do you tell those young African American men who see what happened to that young man who was killed just going out for a jog? It certainly shines an uncomfortable light on those inequalities again.
In exactly the same state, exactly. What I tell them is, look, we have been in this country as a community over 400 plus years. I had the great fortune through a lot of help and people in my life to be able to provide a liberation to another 400 families in that context. And I tell them, look, focus on building systems that are scalable, that bring your capacity as a human spirit into our government, into our justice system, into our world of technology, frankly, into our economic fabric of America. There are so many unfortunate events. We have to, what I call, beat down the hate, bringing, frankly, love and systems that actually help people understand that we are all humans. We're in this together. We've got to actually fight to ensure that our country continues to strive and accelerate. So that's the message I tell them. I want them to focus on education, focus on STEM, focused on, doing the things that are the right elements around human rights and justice in the country that we live in. And I hope that message resonates with them. And I've frankly, hopefully given them an opportunity to do it without the burden of debt that gives them a chance to now express their best selves in the work that they do.
Robert Smith, thanks for coming on Meet the Press, sharing your views on how we can move forward after this pandemic is behind us. Much appreciated. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for inviting me.
When we come back.
It has been an absolute chaotic disaster when that mindset of what's in it for me and to heck with everybody else, when that mindset is operationalized in our government.
Former President Obama's harsh words for President Trump's handling of the coronavirus. Panel is next. Welcome back. The panel is with us from their remote locations. NBC News White House correspondent Kristen Welker. Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations and author of the new book, The World, A Brief Introduction. Just a little quick pamphlet there. And Wall Street Journal columnist Peggy Noonan. It's quite the ambition there, Richard. The world, you know, a small focus for one book. But let me start, Kristen Welker, with you. There's a report this morning that staffers in the White House are a bit rattled. 2 positive tests in the last week. Suddenly, a sobering reminder that the virus is still even inside their house.
That's right, Chuck. This is the week that everything changed at the White House. This is the week that they went from fighting an invisible enemy, as the president has dubbed it, to an enemy that landed squarely on the steps of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And so there's a lot of discussion about how many more officials may need to be in quarantine. Of course, we saw that the head of the FDA, as well as the CDC, Dr. Anthony Fauci, is going to be quarantining in a measured form. But really, it put on display this sharp disconnect, Chuck. The fact that the White House is essentially urging the country to reopen cities and states, and yet those same cities and states do not have the same level of testing that exists at the White House. We know the administration is ramping up testing, 8 million tests so far. They want to try to double that by the end of May, but not clear what the plan is moving forward, Chuck.
Peggy Noonan, it feels like that was what I took away from all of our interviews so far this morning, which was, you know, nobody is saying you can't reopen. You just have to have a plan to do it. And there's just a lot of frustration that there isn't one.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of frustration that there is not really a clear national plan. As for state plans, their criteria for opening in some cases seem a little complex, a little provisional, and dependent on testing and tracing and such turning out very well. It seemed to me, Chuck, your whole theme on this show has been, what is the plan? I think we're realizing we don't have one, and it's going to bubble up from regionally, probably not nationally. But I thought the most interesting thing said this morning that sums up the moment we're in was from one of your doctors at the beginning, who said, where are we? We must learn how to live with this virus. There was a sense from him as he spoke, I kind of thought, yeah, he's saying we're going to have to muddle through. I think maybe one of the ways that would be most helpful to muddle through at this point, as citizens and states take on a lot of responsibility, is just to understand this is a dual crisis. It's not only an illness, it is an economic crisis that's going to demand creativity and ingenuity from all of us.
Richard Haass, given your expertise, I want to ask, I want to look at this from a global perspective here, because the other part of this is odd. The United States is the infected country. It's the country that others around the world don't want to emulate right now. We're not the country that's leading the response to the pandemic, or it doesn't feel this way. What does that mean to you going forward, and how concerning is that to you?
Well, you're right, Chuck. We're not leading by example, and we're not leading full stop. This comes against the backdrop where this administration has largely abdicated the U.S. role of leadership in the world, pulling out of all sorts of agreements. We didn't even participate in the Europe-led effort to come up with a vaccine. And people ought to be worried. Think about the situation right now. You've got all the traditional problems, a rising China, an angry Russia, North Korea, Iran with their nuclear ambitions. Then you've got all the global issues, including the pandemic, but also climate change, terrorism, problems in cyberspace. All this at a time the United States is diminished and we are distracted. And that's a really toxic brew for the future of the world. And what we've learned from this crisis, if things go badly in the world, we are not immune. They go badly for us as well.
Kristen Welker.
Well, Chuck, we know against that backdrop, the president's key focus right now is not just on the medical crisis, but on trying to restart the economy. And it's not clear what the plan is there. We know that his administration officials have shown him numbers that really rattled him. An unemployment rate even greater than what we see right now. We're told that the worst case scenario was topping 30%. So there's a lot of discussion right now within the White House about what to do, how to move forward. We know that some of the things under consideration, delaying tax day, for example, a moratorium on new regulations, but no decisions yet, Chuck, and a sharp divide in Congress between Democrats and Republicans about what, if any, next steps need to be taken. Republicans saying, look, we've already passed $30 trillion in stimulus, but Democrats say state and local governments need even more.
Peggy Noonan, this feels like this is really going to divide the Republican Party on the issue of spending, because you do have some sort of the more populist members, people like Josh Hawley, Marco Rubio, who do think you do need more federal spending. But then you got sort of the more traditionalists who believe that, no, let's focus on the debt, let's focus on the debt. That could hinder the recovery.
I think what we're seeing now, if we see this in the Republican Party, as I suspect we will, between, say, Josh Hawley and Marco, who say, look, this is a crisis. We must spend as wisely as we can, but as much as we need to, versus others who'll say, look, almost ancient conservative principles involve controlling the power of government. It's intrusion, it's expense, it's cost. Sure, that'll be fought out somewhat, but I got to tell you, that argument has been fought out since it's almost part of what produced Donald Trump, who really said to his audiences in 2016, hey, I'm not going to touch government spending. I'm not going to bother these entitlements. I think the base of the party would support an attitude of throw whatever against the wall. You have to see what sticks. We are in a historic crisis. If going against our traditional views will help dig us out, go against them, dig us out.
Richard Haass, I want to get your reaction. The Secretary of State walked back one of the most roughest charges that the U.S. government has been making about the virus against the Chinese. Let me play for you first the accusation, then the Secretary's walk back.
The Chinese government hasn't permitted American scientists to go into China, to go into not only the Wuhan lab, but wherever it needs to go to learn about this virus, to learn about its origins.
We don't have certainty, and there is significant evidence that this came from the laboratory. Those statements can both be true.
I'm of two minds on this, Richard Haass. If this is true, should we be shouting it from the rooftops, go to the UN, present the evidence, and go from there? Or is this going to be something that we're going to regret because it creates basically a Cold War over this virus for the globe to deal with?
Chuck, Chinese performance has been bad, whether this came out of a lab or not. They covered up, they allowed people to leave Wuhan, and we're all paying a price for it. What started in Wuhan didn't stay there. So that's a fact. Again, whether they're covering up the fact it came out of a lab, we don't have information supporting that. The Secretary of State got forward on his skis, and that's always a mistake. People say in war, truth is the first casualty. We ought to husband the truth carefully. The larger issue, though, is, look, the United States and China are the two most powerful countries of this era, the two most influential. Our relationship will go a long ways towards defining the character of this era of history. The challenge for us is going to be to push back against China where we can, criticize them on their pandemic, criticize them on human rights, push back at what they're doing in the South China Sea. But we still need to protect and preserve areas of potential cooperation on climate change or, say, on dealing with the North Korean nuclear challenge. Right. That's going to be a hard piece of foreign policy to get right, but that's the challenge.
All right, I'm going to pause the conversation there. Just an excellent group dynamic, much appreciated. When we come back, how President Trump's slipping poll numbers may be hurting the Republicans' chances of holding the Senate. That's next. Welcome back, Data Download Time. And with Election Day less than 6 months away, it is a good time to remember that control of the United States Senate is also in play, along with the White House. And the last 8 weeks have shown promising signs for Democrats who hope to flip control of the chamber. In early February, the Cook Political Report listed 3 Republican-held seats as toss-ups, seen here in gold: Arizona's Martha McSally, Colorado's Cory Gardner, and Maine's Susan Collins. And 3 more as lean Republican, those in pink: the open seat in Kansas, left by the departing Pat Roberts, plus North Carolina's Tom Tillis and Georgia's Kelly Loeffler. But by the end of April, there were 4 in each category, with Steve Daines of Montana and Iowa's Joni Ernst now in the lean column, and North Carolina shifting to the toss-up column. Let's look at a few of them for which we do have some polling data. In Arizona, McSally has faced a tough race from the beginning against Democrat Mark Kelly, a former astronaut and the husband of former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. It's still a toss-up, but the Real Clear Politics polling average shows McSally down 8 points. Been a while since we've seen any poll showing McSally ahead. Then there's Tom Tillis in North Carolina, who was in the lean GOP category. By the end of April, it became a toss-up race, and polling shows us why, because Tillis essentially is tied with the Democratic nominee Cal Cunningham. And then there's Montana, where Steve Daines was in the solid GOP category. That is, until Steve Bullock, the current governor, decided to run, and now Cook has placed the race to lean GOP. In fact, Bullock was up 7 points in a recent Montana State University of Denver poll, indicating the race is likely a toss-up already as well. Remember, if Joe Biden wins in November, Democrats will need to flip 4 Republican-held seats, assuming Democrat Doug Jones loses in Alabama, and 3 if he somehow holds on. Right now, polls show most Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of the coronavirus crisis, and these trends suggest that down-ballot Republicans are being pulled down by the president's performance as well. When we come back, Tara Reid, Michael Flynn, and what President Trump says he's learned from Nixon and Watergate.
I learned a lot by watching Richard Nixon. Of course, there was one difference, one big difference. Number 1, he may have been guilty, and number 2, he had tapes all over the place. I wasn't guilty, I did nothing wrong, and there are no tapes.
Welcome back. That was President Trump on Friday on Fox and Friends, embracing the comparison with Richard Nixon as he gloated about the Michael Flynn news and denied involvement with Russia to tip the 2016 election. The panel is back. Kristen Welker, the president is obsessed with undoing the Mueller report. And he tweeted some 40-plus times this morning, it seems like, mostly about Michael Flynn.
40-plus times about Michael Flynn just this morning, Chuck. It underscores the fact that this is an issue that looms large for President Trump. It does come after he was gloating after the Attorney General recommended that a judge drop the charges against Michael Flynn. It is worth noting that ultimately it's going to be up to that judge whether he actually decides to move forward with that. But it's opened the Justice Department up to all sorts of criticism yet again that the Attorney General may be working hand in hand with President Trump, something that Bill Barr has denied. But Chuck, here's what I think the critical issue is. The president is still very focused on this, and yet his aides and allies say ultimately on Election Day, he's going to be judged on one issue and one issue alone, his response to the coronavirus crisis, Chuck.
You brought up Bill Barr. Peggy Noonan, I want you to listen to this Bill Barr answer to a question about what will history say about this. Wait till you hear this answer. Take a listen.
When history looks back on this decision, how do you think it will be written?
Well, history is written by the winner, so it largely depends on who's writing the history.
I was struck, Peggy, by the cynicism of the answer. It's a correct answer, but he's the Attorney General. He didn't make the case that he was upholding the rule of law. He was almost admitting that, yeah, this is a political job.
Well, my read on it was a more resigned and world-weary sort of look. We all know the facts on this. I assume that Barr thinks he did the right thing. I mean, my read on this whole thing is that a fellow, General Flynn, who was early on new at a job, rather hapless, perhaps out of his depth, made a terrible mistake. He told a lie. An overexcited government agency or parts of a government agency essentially pushed him around after that. It became a mess. My feeling is, this absorbed a lot of people, was very interesting for a long time, but we are in another point in history, baby. We've got a pandemic and an economic collapse. So whatever on that.
Yeah.
Can I say something about Trump? He compared himself this week to Nixon. Last week it was Lincoln. I just sense there 40 tweets today. He kind of, I think, knows the fact that the original sin of his handling of the pandemic was the failure of testing, the laxness, the lack of focus, the lack of being able to make this work. I think he knows it'll haunt him politically, and I think it will haunt the national experience for some time as we try to deal with this thing. So I think he's deflecting a bit.
Hey, Richard Haas, how's this look to the rest of the world?
Some of the most important things in diplomacy, Chuck, are not what people who work for the State Department do. It's the example we set, whether it's the vibrance and creativity of our economy, the functioning of our political system, our ability to correct mistakes. So the rest of the world looks at this and they shake their head and they go, this is not the United States we thought we knew. And this has real implications. Not only does this weaken would-be Democrats in the world, again, we're hurting the cause of democracy, but increasingly other countries are saying, we're not going to put our eggs in America's basket. We've done that now for 3/4 of a century. We've been well served by our closeness to the United States, but increasingly countries are going to go their own way. And that, to me, makes for a more dangerous world because we need collective answers to some of these challenges like disease or like climate. And if people start taking matters into their own hands, this will be a world of much more proliferation, much more violence. A lot of what we've taken for granted over the last, decades, I'm afraid now that's been put at risk.
Well, unfortunately, we ran out of time to talk about the world of Biden. That's part of Joe Biden's problem these days. When he does get talked about, it's only about one story, the Tara Reade thing. That hasn't gone well for him, but he's still leading in the polls. But we will get to that topic, hopefully, again throughout the week. That's all we have for today. Thank you for watching. Thank you for trusting us. Happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there. Remember to call or Zoom your mother. And we'll be back next week because if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press.